So I'm doing this presentation on Symmetry, Sympathy and Sensation, the Talismatic Efficacy and Slippery Iconographies in early 13th century Iraq, Syria and Anatolia. It was a paper by Persis Berlekamp. I'm going to say that. I'll explain what that is. So Persis Berlekamp is advancing this theory, which he calls talismatic efficacy. And in its essence, what talismatic efficacy means here is he's looking at the public buildings, things that are being made in 12th and 13th century Iraq, Syria, and southern Turkey. And in addition to being things like, this usual stuff you build buildings for, places for people to live, gates, and so on, the material aspects of gates. He's also interested in the fact that these gates also offer a different kind of protection. They incorporate ideas about magic. And this is not just like symbolism. The actual architecture itself has magical qualities that offer magical protection. So this is what we're going to be exploring in this presentation, the idea of magic. So we're going to start with the Talisman Gate in Baghdad. So this gate is a gate into the city. It was constructed somewhere around the 12th or 13th centuries. There was a lot of disputing to exactly when it was built. But some of the earliest inscriptions read that it was built in the year around 1221 by the Abbasid Caliph al-Nasr. However, this gate has been built over older ones, hence the dispute. So there was a gate that predated it, then this was built, maybe it's part of something older. The gate was important, it was an important access point into the city, but it also held symbolic power. And in fact, in 1638, the Ottoman Sultan Murad V, entered Baghdad entered Baghdad through it after conquering the city. He then had the entire gate bricked up so that he'd be the last prince to ever enter the city. And so up and since about then, you've not been able to really use it as a gate, but it was still there. Sadly, though, this gate no longer exists, as it was destroyed by the retreating Ottoman army in 1917 to prevent the Allies from taking it and using it. The purpose of the gate was to protect the city from invaders, floods, and included towers that were around it. So that's the sort of general function of the gate. But here's what we're interested in. Now, for this part, we're going to have to use our imagination a little bit because I don't have an image of it. But the arch columns that supported the gate consisted of crouching lions, which obviously you can't see here, which may serve as a symbolic guardians of the gate. And this is particularly interesting because when you think about Assyrian and Hittite gates, you often see lions as being the guardians at the gate of them. These are practices were clearly adopted into the Arabo-Islamic gate makings in these early centuries. During the 12th century, actually, there was a growing interest in the classical heritage of the region, and we find ancient motifs being incorporated into architecture. This includes classics. This includes in the classics seems to extend to the talismanic knowledge of the ancients. So this is actually something interesting because when you think about heritage, you tend to sort of think about rediscovering the heritage as something that happens in the post-19th century onwards, where people suddenly get very interested in the knowledge of the ancients and sort of reconstruct identities around it. But in the 12th century in Baghdad and other places, something similar happened. And their interest was not solely about, who these people were who came before us. It was also what magical knowledge did they have and can we use it to protect ourselves? So that's something we see around them. The lions, though, just to sort of finish up on the lions, they sort of represent a princely figure, and they also may have astrological significance, right? So the sun, lions sort of represent the sun. It also represents lions. And this is interesting because if you know anything about the history of Baghdad, you will know that Baghdad has a certain astrology, right? It has its own zodiac sign. Much like today, we all have our own personal sun zodiac signs. In the past, cities, countries, and states had their own zodiac signs as well. And Baghdad was picked the foundations of the city were picked for the 30th of July, 762. And specifically, the state was picked so that Baghdad would have the star sign, zodiac sign of Leo. And so possibly the foundations being used at the gate were also a reference to the star sign of Leo. Also, it's a reference to princely figures as well. Now, to what we can see is at the top of the arch, which you can actually see in the image I've provided. There are two serpent dragons even, whose bodies are sort of twisted and the jaws are wide open, which is an image depicting the might and might be inspired by the Mongolian legends. So this might actually be a piece of East Asian heritage being incorporated here, which obviously would lend its support to the idea that maybe this came after 1258 when the Mongols sacked Baghdad. But what I also think it says, and this is what Perry is arguing too, is that it kind of represents a poly-civilizational approach to heritage, taken at a time, meaning heritage came from everywhere. So when we talk about heritage today, obviously we tend to think about our own heritage, and we tend to understand our own heritage in terms of our biological lines, our direct ancestors. But in the 12th century, they took a poly-civilizational approach, meaning they took heritages from different regions, from different parts of the world, and incorporated it into their own and treated it as if it was their own heritage. And they could have multiple identities at the same time. We see this here as well. In the middle, we see of this inscription, we see a princely figure sort of holding the dragons by their side. And the sheer physical strength of the ruler is, you can see here, and it seems likely to have magical significance as it was common in medieval Arabic and Persian literature. The creation of such images and sculptures was designed to protect the palace or the city supernaturally. Created objects with certain motives for magical protection is an idea we find prevalent at the time. 10th century Arab historian al-Masudi recounts the story about Alexander the Great and his Egyptian city of Alexandria being under constant threat from sea monsters. Alexander decided to construct a glass cage and put a group of artists into the glass cage and stick it underneath the sea. And the artist's job was to paint what these sea monsters looked like. And then he raised them, and then he ordered, I think it was reliefs and statues to be constructed around the city of these sea monsters, with the idea that this would somehow repel them from wanting to attack the city. This is an example of what we would call an Alexandrian romance, which is a series of myths constructed around Alexander the Great, which were quite popular in the Middle East at the time. But the identity of the actual prince we see in the middle is hotly disputed, and even the identity of the enemies attacking is disputed. Is this an image of Caliph al-Nasr himself? Does this represent the reigning caliph? Who are the enemies? And are the enemies the assassins? Are they the Mongols? Is it any prince? We don't know, but there's a lot of debate around it. So we go to our next slide. So this one I quite like. So this one, okay, this is cities from Cezare Mosque. So Cezare is today in present-day Turkey and is located, though, on the Syrian-Turkish, Iraqi-Turkish borders and is at the foot of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. However, it was founded in the 9th century by Al-Hussein ibn Umar, who was the Emir of Mosul, and is also known as Jazirat ibn Umar. In the 12th century, the city was on the edge of clashing empires with diverse populations that included Muslims, Jews, Christians, Yazidis, Turks, Arabs, and Kurds, with a wide range of languages spoken. Even crusaders made their homes here, with multiple powers tussling over the city. It is little surprise that the city might seek a talismanic protection. But what makes this one different from the others? Well, the doors have knockers on the entrance to the Grand Mosque of Kizare, which many mosques in the area are likely to have constructed, when lots of mosques in that area were constructed around 1150 and 1160. But what's interesting about these knockers is they can consist of two dragons, which I think you can see, who have flanking lion heads. While it is not clear the exact nature of the talismanic qualities of these particular knockers are, we find references to serpent doors knockers in Persian poetry of al-Nizami. We also find where they act as a kind of guardian to treasures. Al-Nizami also claims that even if you go to Mecca to Kaaba, there are serpent door knockers there as well to protect the Kaaba. So this is an idea we see floating around. If we examine the door knockers, what we see are some interesting details. The dragons appear to be mammalian, appear to have mammalian forelegs and are some kind of hybrid creature with serpents and feline qualities. They also seem to have wings above their heads, and so there's a lot of themes going on here. The dragons also appear to be facing away from one another, suggesting they are repelled by the sight of each other. The dragons with the lion's heads might suggest some astrological properties, as lions represent the sun and dragon fire, meaning the occupants might call upon celestial help for protection. A key thing that distinguishes these door knockers from the Baghdad reliefs is that they are made from bronze and are movable objects. They're not merely for show, they are designed to be used. They were heavy and made loud noise when used. Berlekamp suggests these sounds itself may have had talismanic qualities. The act of hearing them itself invokes a kind of supernatural protection. This is what his theory was. Here I've cheated a little bit because this is not from Berlekamp's paper, but it's complementary to Berlekamp's paper. And I've done this particularly because this particular point of magic in architecture wasn't covered in his paper, but it's complementary to it. And that's the issue of spoiler. I'm going to explain what that is now. So this is from Aleppo. This is the Al-Halawiya Madrasa. So it's an Islamic religious school that was built in 1124, but was built over the site of a Byzantine cathedral of St. Helena, and according to the traditions, was also once a Roman temple. So before it was a cathedral, it was a Roman temple. Spoiler architectures are buildings that are made up of fragments, parts, or on the foundations of an older structure or building. The reuse of older buildings in newer structures was a common practice in the ancient and medieval worlds. It was common in ancient Rome as it was in the Near East. Julia Gonella, who's the one who wrote this paper, suggests that the use of spoiler was not due to a shortage of building materials, but based on the belief of the sacred and talismanic properties of older buildings, from places of worship to public buildings. Medievals wanted to continue the blessings of these structures bestowed, irrespective of their religious differences or changes. Thus, the construction of things like the Al-Halawiya over the old cathedral may not have been an act of religious supremacy, but the need to continue the sacred presence of the church, even as an Islamic religious building. Indeed, the fact that so many different religions used it as a site may have added to the appeal of it. In literary sources, we read that Nur al-Din donated a 3,000-year-old marble altar with a Greek inscription bearing the name of the Roman Emperor Diocletian. He claimed that the altar had the light of God in it. And on special Islamic holidays like Laylat al-Qadr, which is the night of destiny, which is in the last 10 days of Ramadan, where Muslims will often stay up night praying because they believe this is the year that God decides what's going to happen in the following year. On those days, people who had this altar would actually take out the altar in the Al-Halawiya madrasa and use it in their prayer rituals. So even a religious object from a different religion becomes sacred to these people at this time. So that's an example of spoiler. And yeah, so I've got the paper there, and this is me. Thank you very much.